Following the election of 2007, Labor was finally back in power and ready to show the world what a modern progressive government could do. So going into the election of 2010, let's see how well Prime Minister Kevin Rudd is doing. Hello? When did Australia get its first female Prime Minister? I think we've got some explaining to do. In 2007, the Labor Party under Kevin Rudd would be swept into power by Australians looking for change following 11 years of rule by John Howard and his coalition. Straight from the get-go, Rudd would overturn Howard's work choices policy and replace it with a Forward with Fairness plan, which reinstated a lot of the unfair dismissal laws which work choices had abolished, as well as other pro-employee reforms. He would also sign Australia onto the Kyoto Protocol, in which Australia would pledge to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions in an attempt to stop the effects of global warming. Arguably the biggest action Rudd took in his first few months as Prime Minister was his national apology to Indigenous Australians. This apology was primarily aimed at the former Stolen Generation, a group of mixed-race Aboriginal children who were forcibly abducted between 1905 till 1970 from their Indigenous families to be raised by European families and missionary groups with the hopes of customising them with Western culture.
We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians.
The apology was met with overwhelming positivity. However, some criticised the lack of action taken after the speech, arguing that the apology was nothing more than just some words. Rudd's focus on modernising Australia would lead to one of his most ambitious policies, the National Broadband Network. This policy sought to overhaul Australia's existing telecommunications network with a fibre optic system to deliver Australians fast and reliable internet. Rudd's policies were not just limited to the domestic scene. He would withdraw most combat troops from Iraq, and he would also push for the expanded G20 group of countries to replace the G7 as the main body to oversee global economic management, ensuring Australia would have a seat to oversee world affairs. These policies somewhat clashed with US President George Bush, who, unlike Howard, would not get on well with Rudd. However, these tensions would soon be resolved in 2008, with the election of President Barack Obama, who would get on well with Rudd, ensuring the Australian-US alliance would remain strong. Despite Rudd's initial success, he would soon be faced with one of the greatest economic crises when the housing market in the US collapsed, leading to a worldwide recession known as the global financial crisis. This was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and across the world nations were falling into economic turmoil. With signs of a recession beforehand, Rudd would immediately begin preparing the Australian economy for the storms ahead with a massive government stimulus program. This program saw the government spend money directly on initiatives rather than just give stimulus payments to Australian businesses and citizens. These initiatives would include the renovation of the nation's schools to build more classrooms and other facilities, as well as the mass instalment of home insulation systems to reduce Australians' reliance on air conditioning systems. These direct initiative programs would end up being highly successful in ensuring Australians had jobs, and Australia would end up being only one of 3 major nations to not experience a recession. Despite receiving worldwide praise for his rapid economic action, Rudd's solution was not without controversy. The insulation scheme would result in several house fires, and the scheme had seen the government pick up a large amount of debt. As a result, Rudd would propose a super profits tax on the mining industry. This sought to tax the large excess of profits the mining industry was experiencing following a large mining boom the nation had been experiencing since the mid-2000s. This resulted in a huge pushback from the mining industry, which argued that the government was undermining Australia's most important industry. While the government would attempt to fix up the economy, the coalition would attempt to fix up their party, following their brutal defeat in 2007. Liberal Party leader Brendan Nelson was struggling to get support, not only from the Australian public, but also from his own party. Throughout 2008, party loyalty was moving behind Shadow Treasurer Malcolm Turnbull, and Nelson failed to make any major gains on Rudd as preferred Prime Minister. The only major thing Nelson was able to achieve in 2008 was the merging of the Queensland Liberals with the Queensland Nationals to form the Liberal National Party of Queensland, or LNP, thus increasing the number of coalition parties to 4. However, this would end up being Nelson's only major achievement, as in September he would be defeated by Turnbull, becoming one of the shortest serving leaders of the coalition. Now, I'll cover Turnbull in more detail in a later video, but suffice to say he would attempt to take on a more adversarial role against the Rudd government arguing that the stimulus plan was flawed and tax cuts were needed to get the economy back in shape as opposed to tax hikes. However, Turnbull too faced challenges as opposition leader, especially when in 2009 he would attack the government over an alleged report that they had given preferential treatment to a car dealership with links to the government. This ended up backfiring spectacularly when the report was later found out to be forged and no such deal had taken place. The backlash from this blunder would hurt Turnbull in the polls and his party would begin to lose faith in him. However, the final nail in the coffin came with the government's carbon pollution reduction scheme. Since taking office, climate change had been a major focus of the Rudd government, and they planned to tackle it with an emissions trading scheme, which would put economic pressure on the industries to reduce their pollution levels. However, the version proposed by the government was met with mixed reactions from both environmentalists, who felt like the bill in its current form would not adequately tackle climate change, and industry groups who felt like the bill was too restrictive. Despite the bill's flaws, Turnbull indicated his intention to support the bill, and this caused a backlash from his own party, many of whom did not support the bill. As a result, Turnbull would face a leadership challenge led by one Tony Abbott. Born in 1957 in London, Abbott would spend most of his childhood growing up in Sydney. In the late 1970s, he would attend the University of Sydney and later the Queen's College in Oxford. During this time, Abbott would make a name for himself, becoming a major advocate for right-wing ideals in the face of a very left-wing dominated university environment. Abbott would return to Australia in 1983 and would study to join the priesthood, but would later quit and instead work as a journalist before finally entering politics in 1994 for the seat of Warringah. Throughout the Howard government, Abbott would hold multiple positions on the front bench before settling into the health portfolio, and in 1999 Abbott would become one of the main figures arguing for the monarchy, which led him to clash heads with Malcolm Turnbull, who led the Republican movement. Following the 2007 election defeat, Abbott would attempt to run for the leadership, but would be initially unsuccessful. He would eventually try again following Turnbull's dropping popularity, and by one vote would become party leader. This move, however, did not go over well with former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, who would terminate his party's membership, claiming that the Liberal Party was no longer a Liberal Party but a Conservative one. Abbott would immediately work to block Rudd's emissions trading scheme, which would fail in the Senate, much to the embarrassment of Rudd, who had hoped to use the scheme to push his environmental policy. The ETS wasn't the only policy Abbott would oppose. He'd be very critical of the large amount of spending the government was undertaking to combat the GFC, and the large tax burdens it planned to put on the mining sector to pay for it. Despite avoiding a recession, the government was in large debt, and the home insulation scheme had to be scrapped following an inquiry into its safety. The delays into an effective climate policy had led to Rudd being seen as over-promising and under-delivering. There were also internal issues bubbling within the party, with several government staffers resigning over friction with Rudd's leadership style. It was in this climate that a lot of Labour members began to look to Rudd's deputy, Julia Gillard, as an alternative leader due to her more flexible leadership style. Born in 1961 in Barry, Wales, Gillard would move to Australia in 1966, settling into my hometown of Adelaide, where she apparently lived next door to my high school biology teacher. She would study at my own University of Adelaide, but would move to Melbourne to finish her tertiary education. Upon finishing her studies, she would go into industrial law, where she became a major female leader in the industry. During the 90s, she would become Chief of Staff to future Victorian Premier John Brumby, and would bring about affirmative action in the Victorian Labor Party pre-selection process, mandating that at least 35% of winnable seats in an election must have a female member running in them. Following her time as Chief of Staff, Gillard would finally make her way into federal politics, when she won the seat of Lalor in the 1998 federal election. Gillard quickly moved her way into the shadow cabinet, where she became a major female figure in the Labour ranks, and speculation began to be raised that she would run for the leadership position, with polling in 2005 showing her beating both Beazley and Rudd as preferred leader. Despite this, she would remain as a shadow minister until Rudd's 2006 challenge, in which she would support Rudd and would in turn become deputy leader. As deputy leader, she frequently took over from Rudd while he was away overseas, and she quickly gained the support of the party, who preferred her leadership style over Rudd's. This led several major figures in the party to throw their support behind Gillard. With the backing of Labour's top figures, Gillard would approach Rudd on the 23rd of June 2010 to request that he step down or hold a leadership election. Rudd would comply and would call a vote the next day. When he realised that he did not have the votes, Rudd would not stand, becoming the first Prime Minister not to serve a full term since William McMahon in 1972. With Rudd stepping down, Gillard would be elected unopposed as the first female Prime Minister in Australian history. Gillard would not have much time to act as Prime Minister, however, as 2010 was an election year, and only 2 months after taking over, Gillard would head to the polls on the 21st of August 2010. This would be the first election which both leaders had been born overseas since 1914. Abbott and Gillard would only end up debating once, and Abbott would take the chance to attack Labor for the large amount of debt it was taking on, as well as the mining tax. Abbott wasn't the only problem Gillard was facing. Despite having the support of the Labor Party, a lot of Australians did not understand why their elected leader was deposed, and were not so supportive of Gillard as they were of Rudd. And there was also a general sense that Labor was failing as government, with policies being frequently changed and not working. And now Labor had a new leader who seemingly came out of nowhere. As a result, a lot of Australians looked towards third parties going into this election. And the winner was? As the counting began, Labor hoped to be easily re-elected for a second term, but as the election night went on, things began to look very grim, as the party found itself unable to meet the 76-seat requirement to form a government. Eventually the final results came in, and Gillard and Labor found themselves 4 seats short of a majority with only 72 seats, and a slim majority in the two-party preferred of 50.12%. Meanwhile, Abbott and the coalition had also won 72 seats, with only 49.88% of the two-party preferred. As a result, it came down to the 6 crossbenchers to form a government. Newly elected Greens member Adam Bandt would side with Labor, while long-time independent Bob Katter and Western Australian National Tony Crook would side with the coalition. This left the 3 remaining independents to side with one of the 2 parties to form a government, and the following days would see Gillard and Abbott desperately try to win over the support of these 3 members. Finally, after days of agonising waiting, Gillard was able to come out and reveal that she had gained the support of all 3 independents to form the first minority government since World War II. While Labor's lower house results had been a disaster, the party had seen better results in the Senate, with the election of 4 new Green members had, for the first time since the 50s, seen the left get a total majority. The Greens weren't the only ones to gain seats. The DLP made a shocking rise out of the grave to somehow win a seat in Victoria, with John Madigan managing to claw himself the 6th Senate spot. Despite Labor now having a much easier Senate to pass legislation, they now had to deal with a divided House, and an aggressive opposition leader looking to crush the government into an election wipeout in 3 years' time. Come back next time for the election of 2013.